So let's move to the end of the book, where you endorse an acquaintance thesis of scrutability, which is to say is the thesis that all truths are scrutable from truths involving only acquaintance expressions. And moreover, you suggest that this thesis can be explained by means of acquaintance inferentialism, a form of inferentialism anchored to primitive concepts, which we are acquainted with. Such inferentialism would provide the analytic connections that are necessary for deriving all the truths from the base truths of the scrutability thesis. So, at the end of the day, we end up with a picture where everything is grounded on the idea that acquaintance with a set of primitive concepts is essential for our thinking and for knowing everything else. And that this thesis is strongly reminiscent of Russell's thesis about acquaintance, a thesis widely criticized for its appeal to sense data. So, but you don't appeal to sense data, and so could you say in what respect you distance your acquaintance thesis from the original Russellian thesis, and why you think acquaintance is so fundamental for grounding the conceptual structure of reality?
Well, as with the connections to Carnap, the connections to Russell on this project only emerged slowly for me, and it was an interesting surprise to discover that at the end of the day one could end up perhaps vindicating something not too far from an idea of acquaintance playing a special primitive supporting role in our conceptual system. One way I was led there was by thinking about a special class of expressions, those that I call epistemically rigid expressions, picking out the same concept in every epistemically possible world. And water is standardly thought to be a rigid designator, picking out the same referent in every metaphysically possible world, but it's not epistemically rigid. It picks out H2O in some epistemically possible worlds, and XYZ in others. And maybe Hesperus and Phosphorus are like that, and so on. But there are a few expressions that aren't like that. Maybe 0 is one of them, expressions for numbers. Number 2 plausibly picks out the same object, 2, in all epistemically possible worlds. Plus picks out the same relation. I think some property expressions are like this too. Consciousness is epistemically rigid, picks out the same property in all worlds. Maybe even a word like philosopher, or friend, or cause, or law of nature is like this. But it's a special, fairly privileged class of expressions. I think these expressions, unlike water and Hesperus, have the property that you can know what they refer to a priori. Interestingly reminiscent of the Russellian property that you can know, roughly you can know the referent of a concept simply by understanding the concept. That's how it goes for acquaintance for Russell. If you possess the concept 0, you understand it. It's a somewhat more distant relation than idealized, because they say you can know a priori. Still interestingly reminiscent of Russell's acquaintance concept. You might even think there's a class among the epistemically rigid expressions. There's a class of expressions for whom the connection is even more direct. An expression like 0 or conscious. If you grasp the concept, then you can either know what it refers to immediately or be very directly in a position to know what it refers to. So these epistemically rigid concepts have an interesting connection to Russellian acquaintance. I argue independently, I think it's plausible that you can make up a scrutability base that just consists of these epistemically rigid concepts or expressions. Actually, I think you need those, and you need some indexicals like I and that, which is not strictly epistemically rigid. But those are also kind of acquaintance involving expressions on a Russellian view as well. So you get this idea that maybe there's a scrutability base that just involves these acquaintance-like concepts. So maybe Russell ends up being somehow indirectly vindicated. Now, we don't get all the properties of Russellian scrutability base. I mean, you're right, Russell did it with sense data. This doesn't use sense data. I do, though, have acquaintance with phenomenal properties in the base, so properties of experience, and these will serve as basic things for me. In previous work, I'd argued that we do, in fact, stand in these special acquaintance relations to phenomenal properties, and this plays a central role in the story I want to tell about phenomenal concepts and their special epistemological and semantic properties. So I think that's independently motivated. But Russell thought the fundamental objects of acquaintance were sense data, universals of the self. Well, actually, what do I have? I've got experiences, phenomenal properties, a few key universals of primitive, like maybe gnomic ones like causation or law of nature, There's an interesting connection to Russell's basic acquaintance expressions. Russell appealed to acquaintance with sense data, with certain universals, and sometimes to the self, acquaintance with self. I have in my scrutability base, well, I've got phenomenal expressions, so that's roughly experiences. I think we're acquainted with phenomenal properties. Some other universals, like maybe causation or law of nature, maybe some spatiotemporal expressions will be in there as well. You can think of these as corresponding to Russell's universals, and they also have indexicals. Well, I and thou. Maybe that's fairly closely analogous to Russell's appeal to the self. And I think of all of these, I think of the first two as being epistemically rigid conceptions of properties, and the indexicals as involving a certain kind of acquaintance with particulars. So in fact we get a scrutability base, which is not exactly the same as Russell's acquaintance base for his constructions, but isn't all that far away. I think it's not a phenomenal space, it's not just sense data, but it's very crucial here. We have non-phenomenal universals, like things like external world relations, like causation, and perhaps spatiotemporal relations, to avoid all the problems of phenomenalism. But there are versions of Russell's project where he can appeal to those universals construed non-phenomenally to ground his project. And I think in particular, there's now an interesting connection to the Russellian idea that acquaintance is fundamental to our conceptual system. Russell said basically to understand a proposition, you have to be acquainted with its constituents. Well, I think for every proposition that we understand, at least that's in effect to say that every concept is composed from acquaintance concepts, or defined in terms of acquaintance concepts. Now, in general, I'm skeptical of the picture where concepts are composed from more basic concepts or defined in terms of them. But I think that relation should be replaced by something like the scrutability relation. All thoughts are not composed from more basic concepts, but scrutable from the basic concepts. And as you mentioned in the scrutability picture, this comes up as a certain kind of inferentialism. All thoughts are characterized by their inferential role with respect to the primitive concepts. So now, for the primitive concepts of these acquaintance concepts, then we get the idea that somehow all thought is grounded in its relation to certain primitive concepts, akin to Russell's acquaintance concepts, that play this role as kind of the anchors for our conceptual system. I don't know exactly how far this can be taken, and you might just take this as a point about concepts and perhaps about epistemology, and not yet about metaphysics. Or you might try and go further and connect acquaintance to the fundamental metaphysical structure of reality. I at least speculate along those lines at the end of the book, but I do find it quite interesting and a bit surprising that all these connections to apparently outmoded ideas, people think of Russell being long refuted, just as they think of the same thing about Carnap. I do find it interesting that ideas, at least in the spirit of Russell and Carnap, can be made to look at least not wholly implausible within this framework.
All right, last question about philosophy. So, philosophy is often seen as a never-ending dispute that cannot bring to any conclusive appraisal of any philosophical truth. Some people are very skeptical about whether it can have any kind of philosophical knowledge. Some have even thought that this is a symptom of the fact that there are no substantial philosophical disputes and hence no philosophical progress is possible. So your work on scrutability is related to the notion of translucency that you have used in another work, in verbal disputes, for clarifying the nature of philosophical dispute and for resolving some of them, perhaps, when they are merely verbal. So could you say something more on this idea? Could you say that there can be progress then in philosophy once the method of translucent settling is applied? Can this method leave us with substantial issues underlying a philosophical dispute that remain to be resolved?
Yeah, so this is another place where I end up being sympathetic with themes that are central in Carnap's work. Carnap is very frequently taken by the view that philosophical views are pseudo-problems that arise from the use of words and from different parties using words differently. So in effect, they're engaged in a verbal dispute that just masquerades as a substantial dispute. And I'm inclined to think that quite often philosophical disputes, some quite central philosophical disputes, have at least elements of verbal disputation in them. And unlike kind of, I don't think they're wholly verbal. I think there's often substantial elements mixed in, but a lot of verbal elements mixed in as well. And I see this happening in many different areas of philosophy. Certainly in disputes in the philosophy of language about what is meaning, or what is content, or what is semantic content. People are just imposing different constraints on what explanatory roles they want meaning or semantic content to play, and therefore end up having partly verbal disputes driven by those disputes. Sometimes you can see potentially verbal disputes in debates over, say, free will, or over what counts as physicalism, or maybe even disputes over what counts as law, or over concepts. I see this happening again and again. So I wrote this article on verbal disputes, basically to try and spell out a method for detecting and diagnosing verbal disputes in philosophy and elsewhere, and to boil it down to the substantial disputes that underlie them. Because I think usually, at least very often, there is a substantial dispute underlying a verbal dispute. Maybe the dispute over meaning or content has some substantial dispute over what kinds of things need to be explained and what's going to explain them in a theory of language. But often those disputes are best put without using the original terms. This is what I call the method of elimination. To really get non-verbally at the substantial issues in your debate over meaning, don't use the word meaning. Try and recast the issues in some other terms, whether this kind of property can explain this kind of property of expressions. This doesn't eliminate substantial disputes, but it helps at least clarify the original disputes. I certainly don't think all disputes in philosophy are verbal. One place this comes out is that even in the paper on the methodology of the article on verbal disputes, it ends up being there's a class of what I call bedrock concepts that aren't susceptible to this method. They're so primitive that it's hard to state relevant disputes without them, but nonetheless aren't such that the disputes are verbal. I think consciousness may be such an expression, maybe certain normative expressions like good or right, maybe existence, at least by some people's lights, is such an expression. I'm inclined to think that disputes involving these expressions are not verbal, they're particularly substantive, and not straightforward to resolve, of course. Ultimately, I think the methodology of elimination that I suggested in that article on verbal disputes suggests the possibility, at least in principle, resolving all philosophical disputes into disputes over the bedrock concepts, maybe including disputes over which concepts actually are the bedrock concepts, which different philosophers will disagree about. So I think of that as a kind of Carnapian, not total dissolution of philosophical problems, at least a resolution of philosophical problems into the underlying core issues, and that kind of clarification can at least serve as a kind of philosophical progress. I don't think it's going to make all philosophical problems go away. The hardest problems, things like the mind-body problem and so on, the problem of what's the right thing to do and so on, are going to remain even within this framework. And I think further methods going to be required to make progress on those problems. And progress in philosophy is notoriously difficult to achieve. But at least a limited progress of clarifying an issue down to its most fundamental conceptual elements, I think, is a useful kind of progress. And it does connect in an interesting way to the project of constructing the world, which is all about a level of primitive concepts underlying all these higher level concepts. In effect, the thought is that, this kind of, the structure I'm talking about, the bedrock concepts, corresponds very much to a scrutability structure. Precisely when we have this kind of scrutability, or a certain kind of scrutability of high-level statements, the low-level ones, then we might expect this method of being able to set aside the disputes over the high-level statements in terms of disputes over the low-level statements. Originally, I thought I'd build in the material on verbal disputes to the book, Constructing the World, as its last chapter, and the book just got too long. It's already 500 pages, it would have been 600 pages. So I decided it wasn't absolutely essential when I set it aside, but I do view it as, it's part of what I call the extended edition of the book, which the relevant material can be found online, and I do think of it very much in the same spirit.
Okay, well, thank you very much for this interview.
Thanks a lot, it's been a pleasure.